Okay, hello guys, let's turn this music off. Sorry for that little bit of a tricky start there, but hopefully all up and running now. Hello everybody, how are you doing? We are here in the last act of the play. Who knew? We finally got there. So yeah, Act 5 Scene 1 today. Tasks as before over here. Read and annotate Act 5 Scene 1, pretty straightforward. The prep sheet went up this morning. A second one for a page of notes on the nature of the gravedigger conversation. There's some more guidance on the assignment page for you. And then I think a lot of us seem to enjoy the poster stuff with Ophelia last time, so I've got another poster on Laertes here today. So that's that. This is the scene. This is the gravedigger scene with the skull. Unfortunately, I left the skull at work, so we have instead today this copy of Train Spotting with a skull, which I'll be using instead as a Yorick stand-in. Obviously, please, if you want to read Train Spotting yourselves, it's a good book. So there's a separate plug there for some extended reading. It won't help you with Hamlet at all, but it will be some good fun for you. So that's what we're going to be doing today. It's Act 5, Scene 1. As a quick reminder of a couple of other things as well. I put a video up last week on AO5. Hopefully a couple of you watched that. If it was, please tell me. And obviously, I will want to make more of those. So that's good. Almost all of I think anyone except for the very late ones, all of you should have your Polonius essays back now. And I went through the feedback for that last week. So please check that sheet that I sent out to everybody. But obviously you've had a couple of weeks now. You should have had, if you'd handed it in on time originally, you should have had at least a week and a bit now to go through that. So next week we'll move to our second. We're actually going to go to another essay, except for it won't be a Hamlet one, because we need to be revising the Duchess of Malfi. So for next week we're going to be doing a Duchess of Malfi assessment. So please make sure you're revising Duchess, okay? Because that's something that we just have to keep it doing now from now until the end of the course in a year's time, okay? So that's that. There's going to be a couple of polls today in the chat, so make sure you're using them. We're going to have, I think, 2, maybe 1. We'll see how we get on. Looking at Act 5, Scene 1. So the most important objectives today that we're going to look at, and what I'm trying to do today with Act 5 Scene 1, is use this not only to introduce some of the standard AO5 that we're doing, but also to look a little bit at critical approaches. In that AO5 guide video, I talked about the idea of talking about from a Marxist perspective or from a feminist perspective or something like that. And today we're going to be introducing ourselves to what actually Marxist perspectives are, what they look like, and how we can talk about them properly. And Act 5 Scene 1 is a really, really good scene to do that with. Okay, so today is a little bit of an introduction to Marxist theory as well with regards to literature. So, let's get cracking. 5.1. So we have the gravediggers introduced to us. Now, the stage directions will list them, it says, as enter 2 clowns. In whatever version, because you obviously have to get a new version for the final exam, a non-critical one. Whatever version you have there might refer to them by all kinds of different names. Some will call them the gravediggers, some will call them clowns, some will call them something else. The clowns is just a term simply, and Hamlet actually himself identifies for us what a clown is earlier in the play, when he talks about the nature of acting, and he's describing this to the players at the start of Act 3, Scene 2. So that section there really is the kind of bit where he's kind of talking about, like, don't, be too loud and too false, and he talks about the possibility of the clowns to run away with the show and kind of be too funny, too silly. The clown essentially then would be an actor or actors who would essentially always play or mostly play the roles of a kind of usually lower class and usually slightly comic role in the narrative. Okay, in this case, Certainly, at least one of them plays the gravedigger. In this scene, it's listed as a gravedigger and a second man who doesn't have a specific profession. However, in other versions, there is a listing as a second gravedigger. So that is something that can be done there with the play. So what I want to talk about first is I'm going to just go through this opening question from the gravedigger. I'm not going to kind of do anything more than that. And it is she to be buried in Christian burial when she willfully seeks her own salvation? So the opening question of the gravedigger, not even looking at that line, asks us whether or not Ophelia's death was a suicide, whether it was an accidental death or a suicide. So his opening question there. And my question for you ultimately, this is going to go in to the live chat now as a quick poll. But it's essentially this, is what do you think, guys? Do you think that Ophelia's death was a suicide or not? So I'm going to stick that in poll now. And we have yes and no. Alright. So I'm going to give you guys a couple of minutes there. I'm going to put this on the hold thing, and I'm going to give you a minute or so just to put a response into that, and then we're going to crack on. Okay? Cool. Interactive. Disappointing technological error here. That has not worked for whatever reason. I added it to the chat, and then we don't know where it's gone. Oh, there we go. Let's see if we can get that working over the course of the session. Let's try it again. There we go, up and running. So we don't have time for the pause now. So if you could submit that before I get to the end of the next page, that'd be fantastic. Get some votes in there. Pretty strong showing there on one side of things. Excellent. So almost everyone, well, so far, yeah. So pretty confident there at the moment. Rising up to, 91%. They're pretty much in favour of the argument that Ophelia's death is a suicide. So a heavy weighting there, I would argue. So that seems to be, and I think the reason why I wanted to do this as well is the Queen's description of it in the play is kind of ambiguous, as we saw previously. The Queen kind of suggests it might be accidental. But the gravedigger seems to share your guys' opinion. Most of you are online with him. He asks whether or not she is going to be given a burial, seeing as she has willfully sought her own salvation. His question then realistically is, should Ophelia be getting buried? And this is obviously key to AO3 for the play, in that essentially this is an argument made out of the fact that at the time period especially, anyone who was committing suicide would be not able to be buried in a traditional Christian manner. You would need to be they would be denied religious burial and would often be buried in a unsacred ground, usually somewhere by a roadside or somewhere else that would be a kind of disturbed space, so as that they could not access any kind of religious salvation. And it's a sin and all kinds of other stuff as well. So realistically, the gravedigger here seems to question whether or not she deserves this burial, and they go through, and the gravedigger kind of relies upon this argument. He kind of takes it and he goes through this kind of almost like legalistic language to kind of explore this. He says, "How can that be?" And she drowned herself in her own defense. And the man's like, "Well, it was found in an examiner that it was, in an examination of the case, that it was fine." And the gravedigger kind of goes on with this argument. He says, "It cannot be else, for here lies the point. If I drown myself wittingly," it argues an act, and an act hath three branches. There's a nice bit of a pun there on the kind of the branches of which she fell off. It is to act, to do, to perform. Argal, she drowned herself wittingly. So he uses this very kind of legalistic, kind of almost kind of like officious tone, which is quite interesting. It's quite a different style of talking to the other characters. But what you'll also notice as well is that the gravedigger speaks in prose, something that we have previously associated with madness, but in this scene we should be associating with a class status issue. The second man is like, "No, but just listen, listen, gravedigger." He's like, "Give me leave. Here lies the water." And he does, you'll usually have some miming, and he kind of mimes out the process of either the man going to the water and drowning himself, or the water coming to the man and drowning him. So whether it is accidental or intentional. So there's a little bit of like a kind of like a, it's like almost like a folk logic. It's like a way of kind of making logic and philosophy and arguments here quite basic and rudimentary for a kind of a lower class audience. And that's actually a really interesting thing here, because that's essentially what the gravedigger does. And he kind of carries on, and that's the coroner's inquest law. He says, "Will you have the truth on it? If this had not been a gentlewoman, she would have been buried out a Christian burial." And this is the interesting argument here, that the second man says, realistically, if this had not been somebody of status, a gentlewoman as it says, then she would have been buried out of Christian burial. Yeah. And he says, "Why there thou sayest, and the more pity that great folk should have countenance in this world to drown or hang themselves more than they're even Christian." So this is a really kind of powerful comment made here by the gravedigger, who I'm going to bring in some AO5 on this as well. So let's have a quick look at some AO5 for this. So this is a really powerful comment. So this is the first article I put in your reading today, and this is from an online article that I've posted here. But essentially the gravediggers are kind of reflecting certain attitudes of the kind of working classes, and specifically kind of calling back to some language used in the Peasant Revolt of 1381, by essentially arguing that the people in power, unsurprisingly, abuse their position and status in order to kind of get away with things that the lower classes would not be able to do so. So he presents his argument: there is no ancient gentleman but gardeners, ditchers, and gravemakers. They hold up Adam's profession. So he kind of links his people, the kind of the under professions, as being kind of powerful people, or not powerful people, but certainly kind of people of tradition. And he mourns the fact that great folk should have countenance in the world to drown or hang themselves more than they're even Christian, i.e. somebody who is equal to them. So there's really a language from this gravedigger of kind of an unjust system above us, above them, kind of the elite system above, that Ophelia has benefited from this burial because she's of wealth and status. And actually, as it turns out later on in the scene, that the king has kind of pushed this funeral through, potentially as a consequence of so many deaths recently, that he just wants to make sure that this one goes okay. And there's a nice illustration here, perhaps visually, of the gap in class between Hamlet and Horatio here, and the gravedigger, who, using this more traditional dress, gives us an understanding as to the kind of complete wealth and class gap. That's not to say that the gravedigger is in any way it's presented as not clever, which is the key thing here, is that Shakespeare does not undermine the intelligence of his working class characters, and in fact presents them as follows. This is an argument from Maurice Hunt. But the argument here at the end is that the gravedigger conforms for the most part to a third role, that of the proletarian, i.e. kind of working lower class, who was traditionally believed to possess an intuitive wisdom by virtue of his special affinity to nature or the deity, which could yield insights denied to the more intelligent and mature. Now this is an argument made essentially that because of their position and status, that there is a kind of, I suppose, a different kind of intelligence, a kind of natural intelligence that the gravedigger possesses here. So here this makes this argument. Now this is why I've linked this scene today to Marxist reading of text. Now what Marxist critics like to do, what it is their job to do, is to explore a text on the basis of class boundaries and distinctions and those relationships specifically. So here's a little page for you here. Again, essentially the main question of the Marxist critic is twofold. One, within the work itself, what narratives, what does the narrative and the themes and the stories, who and what ideology does that benefit? And then secondly, the production of the text itself, how and what does that benefit? So within a literary text, what questions the critic might ask would be perhaps, and you will ask from a Marxist perspective, is who does it benefit if the work or the themes are believed, successful, whatever, that kind of stuff. What is the social class of the author? It's quite tricky with Shakespeare, but you get the idea. What class does the work claim to represent? What values does it reinforce? What values does it subvert? What conflict can be seen between the values in the play itself? What social classes do the characters represent? And how do characters from different classes interact or conflict? So these are questions that you might just want to ask yourself when you're going through the text, going like, what are the classes in this play? What are the what kind of figures do we see in the play? What narrative do we kind of reinforce by the themes of the play? Does this play suppose a realistic, does it impose a kind of class view on us as a society? And I think the answer to all those questions is yes, it does impose it imposes a structure, but I suppose you're going to have to tell me what that is in a second. So obviously during the comments, guys, as we go along and as you work this out, it'd be great if you could kind of talk to me about what classes are represented in the play. Just drop them in the comments in the chat, and how you think this play kind of reinforces a kind of cultural structure narrative, because I think it does, but I think it's important to note that it is. If you want to do it, I think simplify the plot a little bit and then you'll see. This, however, I would say realistically is the only scene where we do have, as I've said before, is the only scene where we have a proper, I suppose the guards at the start of the play, a sustained then presence from somebody outside of the ruling class of the play. So he asks for his spade and he goes to dig, and then as he goes on, here's the quote that we talked about previously, that his profession is a kind of old and noble profession. It's Adam's profession, one of the first professions, as he suggests. And then the second man pulls up that joke even further. Was he a gentleman, i.e. Adam, and was the first that ever bore arms? I'll put another question to you. If thou answerest me not, to the purpose confess thyself. So the first gravedigger here, kind of playing around with this, and they are very kind of pun making, joke making. And he asks him this question. He says, "What is he that builds stronger than either the mason, the shipwright, or the carpenter?" And they do this kind of like joke. The second man, the gallows maker, for he that outlives 1,000 tenants. So the second man goes, well, the person that makes the strongest thing is somebody who makes a gallows. So gallows is where you hang people from. And the gravedigger likes this joke. He's like, yep, it's funny, it's clever. I like thy wit well. The gallows does well, but how does it well? It does well to those that do ill. So there's a kind of playing around with words, double meanings. Now, we've seen this previously in Hamlet, and the gravedigger was the only other character to really do it to this extent. It says, now thou dost ill to say the gallows is built stronger than the church. Argyle, the gallows may do well to thee. To it again come. Who builds stronger than a mason, a shipwright, or a carpenter? I. Tell me that and unyoke. Marry, now I can tell. To it. Mass, I cannot tell. Cudge thy brains no more about it, for your your dull ass will not mend his pace with heating. And when you have asked this question, next say a grave maker, the houses he makes last till doomsday. Go get thee in and fetch me a stoop of liquor. So we have the ultimate argument is that the gravedigger kind of bigs up the profession of grave digging, grave making, by doing this kind of like riddle-esque joke scenario. Lots of puns, lots of wordplay, lots of kind of intricate language play here. But as I said, all in prose, all very much in a kind of straightforward manner. And ultimately, he says, yeah, that the gravedigger, as a kind of profession, brings with him these strong houses that last till doomsday, kind of reinforming some Protestant belief in terms of the nature of death as well. So we're fully established. It's literally a gravedigger in a grave, talking about graves and dying and death and whatever else. So quite clearly, this scene is wholly around death. So the second man leaves. I'm not going to sing the song. Sorry to all fans of me singing. But as he's singing a song, we have Hamlet and Horatio enter the scene. So Hamlet is back for the first time in the play. He's come back off his pirate adventures, and he's probably at this point wearing some kind of disguise or alternate costume or something, maybe a cloak or a cape, or I think in the David Tennant version he's just wearing kind of travelling clothes. He looks much less he's not dressed as kind of royalty or anything. So Hamlet kind of comes on the scene and he's like, does this guy not know what he's doing, like his job? Does he not have any feeling of his business? Does he not have any kind of awareness, emotional understanding of his business? He sings making graves. And actually the point here is that Horatio makes for us is that as a custom hath made it in him a property of easiness, i.e. that the gravedigger has, because he has spent his life digging graves, he knows intimately what this is like better than someone like Hamlet, the intellectual, who kind of thinks about this as a bad thing but doesn't really know what it's like, whereas the gravedigger does. Yeah, and this brings us back to that point I was making earlier. If we flip back over here from the Hunt text, this idea is that the gravedigger shows us a limitation in Hamlet, and it gets Hamlet to actually realise more ideas and philosophical issues than he does before, which is great. The gravedigger continues singing, and Hamlet comes across a skull on the ground. Now, as an interesting point here, if you're ever wondering why there's so many skulls in this scene and why all the bones are being chucked around, at the time period, grave sites would probably essentially have been buried all over each other. Grounds would be dug up, old bones would be taken out of the ground, whoever they were, and possibly either placed in a charnel house, which is where the skeletons would be stored. If any of you have seen the catacombs of Paris, you'll see what those look like. Or they would just be thrown away, smashed up, used for whatever else. So Hamlet comes across this skull. Again, not this skull, it's not the skull yet, it's not this one yet. But the skull had a tongue in it, and he says, and it could sing once. Now the knave jowls at the ground. Knave, guys, remember as a term, we've used a whole bunch of times in the play, but knave is just somebody of like low morals, a kind of rogue, a kind of a rascal, so to speak. As if it were Cain's jawbone that did the first murder, that might be the pate of a politician, which this ass now o'erreaches, one that could circumvent God, might it not? So Hamlet here is like, how is he throwing around these skulls? Why is he just throwing these bones around? They used to belong to somebody. He says that had a tongue in it once. That used to be somebody's body. And now this guy is just flinging it around. He's like, what? How can he do this? He's like, this guy of a lower status, that could have been a politician's skull or a religious person or whatever. It could have been somebody of higher importance than him. And we're starting to bring back the idea that he's mentioned earlier in the play, and if anyone can tell me this, I will, do. I'm not going to have any awards or anything, but I'll be pleased. So over the next 5 minutes, guys, if you can tell me what scene this is linking to, the themes of, and it will become more obvious as this scene goes on, I think. But Hamlet's idea here that this body has been reduced to nothingness, I suppose, after death, links back to an earlier scene in the play with an interaction with Hamlet and another character. Please tell me in the comments which one that is, and then we'll go through that once you've mentioned it over to me. So Horatio, is like, it might have been this person. And it's like, or of a courtier who could say, "Good morrow, sweet lord. How dost thou, sweet lord? This might be my lord, such a one that praised my lord, such a one's horse who's went to beg it." So Hamlet's kind of doing a little joke here about the kind of sycophancy of a courtier here as well. Mostly just a little joke there. So Hamlet again continues, "Why even so? Now my lady worms chapless and knocked about the mazard with a sexton spade. Here's fine revolution, and we had the trick to see it. Did these bones cost no more than the breeding, but to play at loggets with them, mine aches to think about it." So again here he brings up this idea, here's fine revolution, the idea that this figure in the gravedigger is now finally in a position where he can lord over people of a higher status and class than him, because he now has kind of control of their bodies and bones. Again, guys, if this theme is becoming more obvious, please chuck over the response, because this theme is kind of really building on itself now. This idea that it will reach its peak in a minute. Oh, here we go. Is this the right answer, Abby? Yep, absolutely, Abby. You have got it completely correct. Yes, well done. Congratulations. It is exactly like the fishing metaphor when he's talking earlier to the king in Act 4, Scene 3. How a king may go through the guts of a beggar is exactly the thing. Well done. Bang on. So, yeah. The gravedigger is still continuing to sing, and Hamlet finds throwing up another skull. That Hamlet kind of goes, "Was this the skull of a lawyer? Where be his quiddities now, his quillets?" And he just goes on to give another. I'm not going to read through all of this. You can go through it. What you'll also notice here, though, is that Hamlet's speech is in prose again here. Now, whether this is because he's adopting a kind of lower class persona, or whether it is perhaps he's kind of supposed to be slightly incoherent in this scene, hard to tell. But he basically just repeats the same ideas he's already been talking about. So that does happen a lot in this scene. There's quite a lot of repetition of ideas. And then we get to eventually, once we kind of go through some more of that, Hamlet decides to actually talk to the gravedigger here. He says, "Right, fine, I'm done with this. I'm going to go and talk to this gravedigger, and I'm going to ask him some questions. Let's set this out." Now, the gravedigger's speech, as an interesting note, if you watch the Tennant version, as a quick reminder for those of you who have seen it, there's a shot from it. There's the gravedigger. While he's dressed quite smartly in this, in a formal way, they do give him an accent. He's very much got quite a broad northern accent as a kind of indicator of class and status, which kind of reinforces that point here. So he comes to discuss with the gravedigger, whose grave it is. He doesn't know who it is. It's quite clearly in a graveyard for people who have status, given that the kind of qualities and professions that he lists going into it. And he asks whose grave it is to be, and the gravedigger, being very much a kind of joker, a kind of comic figure to an extent, starts off his series of jokes. Now, obviously, guys, I'm going to go through and explain jokes. Jokes aren't funny no joke is ever funny when you have to have your teacher sit there and talk you through and explain them to you. But I do think some of these jokes are quite good. So he asks whose grave it is, and the gravedigger is just like, "It's my grave." And Hamlet is, like, "Well, I think it is yours because you liest in it." Now, liest here being used as a double meaning, both literally to lie as in physically, to lie in the grave, but also lie as in to tell a lie. So there's this kind of joke made here that the gravedigger is both in the grave but also lying about the grave. The gravedigger, "Lie out on it, sir, and therefore 'tis not yours. For my part, I do not lie in it, yet it is mine." So the gravedigger is playing out of Hamlet. This is the first time, realistically, in the whole play that Hamlet has been directly challenged on his wordplay. Hamlet was constantly messing around, especially at the start, with the king and the queen, kind of playing around with words, playing around with puns, that kind of stuff. No one really challenges him on it there. Here they do, and it's the gravedigger that does it, which is interesting. Thinking about, again, those class dynamics in the play, thinking about what the gravedigger brings to this play is really interesting kind of stuff. Hamlet continues to go on with this lie joke, and he basically gets it out of him. He's like, "Look, who is going to be in this grave?" He's like, "'Tis a quick lie. We'll get a wave again from me to you." For the dead, not for the quick. This is a kind of metaphor between the living and the dead. Hamlet continues, what man dost thou dig it for? For no man, sir. What woman then? None either. Who is to be buried in it? One that was a woman, sir, but now, rest her soul, she's dead. So the gravedigger is continuing to play around with kind of technical definitions. He's very much it's very much the school of jokes that relies on like specifically really precise word, like semantics of language. And Hamlet is just turns to Horatio and is like, look how very, how pedantic the knave is. We must speak by the card, or equivocation will undo us. Basically, we must be really precise in our language, otherwise this gravedigger is just going to mess us around. Yeah. He said, look, Horatio, this 3 years I've took note of it. The age has grown so picked that the toe of the peasant comes so near the heel of the courtier, he galls his kive. How long hast thou been gravemaker? So he's saying here, look, the lower classes, the status in society is raising up towards the bottom of the courtier class, suggesting a slight mobility in status and class in the time period. Again, that's quite interesting and doesn't come up anywhere else really in the play. So this scene does have a kind of really interesting kind of social position in the narrative. So it's like, how long have you been a gravemaker? And this is where we get the confirmation of Hamlet's age. The gravedigger says, of the days of the year that I came to that day that our last King Hamlet overcame Fortinbras. So that was, he says, I became a gravedigger when King Hamlet, the old Hamlet that is, killed Fortinbras. It's how long ago is that? And he's like, how cannot you tell that? Every fool can tell that. So the gravedigger kind of gives us a bit of cheek there. And he say, it is the very day that young Hamlet was born, he that is mad and sent into England. So that gives us a nice kind of thematic narrative here, is that Hamlet's birth was while the king was absent, interestingly, at war, but also that the king's most famous victory was on the same day as Hamlet's father's greatest, Hamlet's birth, and this. So I don't know what I'm saying there. Hamlet's birth is on the same day as his father's greatest victory. That's what I'm trying to say. There we go. So I think that's a really interesting kind of point to make, maybe thematically. Hamlet asks why young Hamlet was sent into England. This gravedigger clearly not recognising Hamlet as who he is. The disguise working well. And the gravedigger just goes like, yeah, because he was mad. Shall recover his wits there. If he does not, it is no great matter there. And he's like, well, why does it not matter if he doesn't recover his wits in England? Why is it okay for him to stay mad in England here? And it's a good joke about the English audience. He says, "'Twill not be seen in him there the men are as mad as he." So we have this joke essentially that all Englishmen are mad. We have the same deprecatory humour that we saw in the Duchess of Malfi. So as a contextual note, this kind of self-aware, kind of self-critical humour is quite common for the time. We saw that in the crazed fashion of the madman who was the tailor madman of the Duchess of Malfi, who was driven mad by new fashions. And then Hamlet asks how he became mad, and he's like, okay, and he continues the jokes. I'm not going to explain them; they're pretty straightforward. But Hamlet asking, upon what ground? Why, here in Denmark, I have been sexton here, man and boy, 30 years. So there's Hamlet's age confirmed. Hamlet is 30 years old. How long will a man lie in the earth before he rots? And then the gravedigger gives a lovely line here. Faith, if he be not rotten before he dies. That's a lovely bit about, essentially corruption and ideas of that there. So we have many pocky corpses that will scarce hold the laying in. A will last you some 8 year or 9 year. A tanner will last you 9 year. And then there's a nice joke about the tanner being essentially because he hides himself, his own body will keep out water longer. Which is that's a pretty reasonable joke. So he pulls out a skull and he's like, hey, do you know whose skull this is? And this is the one. This is our stand-in today, but yeah, this is the one. This is the big moment we've all been waiting for. Here is Yorick's skull. He says, whoreson mad fellow it was. Who do you think this was? And Hamlet doesn't have any idea because it's a skull. It looks like everybody else's skull. They're not distinguishable one from the other realistically. And it turns out that it was the king's former jester. That we assume that is the king, Hamlet. And Hamlet's like, what, this? And he's like, oh, poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest. Famously, there's quite a complex and very lengthy postmodernist novel called Infinite Jest that you could read from it. Of most excellent fancy, he hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now how abhorred in my imagination it is. Abhorred here means kind of like repulsed, disgusted, detested, whatever. Filled with horror, as it says at the bottom. In my imagination it is. My gorge rises at it. How here hung these lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of gambols like dances and jokes around, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar. Not one now to mock your own grinning, quite chapfallen. Now get you to my lady's table and tell her, let her paint an inch thick. To this favour she must come. Make her laugh at that. So Hamlet goes through this list of all the qualities that Yorick had when he was alive. Yeah, that he was this fun, expressive, singing, dancing jester, and now he's just a skull. He's lost all of these attributes. They're gone. They've all gone away, which is a really interesting point, I think, for us to make here about the nature of death. And I think this is mostly the kind of core part of the scene. And this is where he starts building it back up again, and he kind of goes into those kind of themes that we've already established earlier in the play, as Abby said. But he turns to Horatio. He's like, "Look, do you think that Alexander looked like this?" Obviously, comments, guys, if anyone can tell me who the Alexander being referenced here is. So looked on this fashion in the earth, even so, and smelt so. There's a little joke there, but obviously the rottenness of the body that he's looking at. To what base uses we may return, Horatio? Why might not imagination trace the noble dust of Alexander till I find it stopping a bunghole? So a bunghole, just a kind of as a stopper there. Realistically, like, I don't know, in a cask of beer or a cask of wine, a barrel of ale. This great figure, Alexander. Again, anyone who can tell me who the Alexander is, fantastic. But this great figure, it is Alexander the Great. That is absolutely who it is. It is Alexander the Great. Well done. So he's about to mention Caesar as well, but Alexander the Great. Both two men that have these kind of huge statues dedicated to them and artworks like this. These great classical figures who are kind of renowned throughout history. Who was it that said that? Let's see. Faye. Well done. Absolutely bang on. Yep, it was Alexander the Great. These great figures of classical culture have now become, essentially dust and dirt, and are being used for the most mundane of purposes. Yeah, with modesty enough and likely to lead. Alexander died. Alexander was buried. Alexander returneth to dust. The dust is earth. Of earth we make loam, and why of that loam whereto he was converted might they not stop a beer barrel? So it's this process. It's exactly the same as that a king go through the guts of the beggar narrative. It's you have this figure, Alexander, goes from brilliant, he's the best, literally pretty incredible. I'm going to quick, Alexander by his mid-20s, for the time period, had conquered huge swathes of the Middle East all the way over to India. He was this impressive historical figure that was kind of renowned for generations. Future military leaders constantly would go there and visit his graves. Julius Caesar himself did that. But he became dust like everybody else. He died. Now he's just he could just be stopping up a beer barrel. And he runs this kind of analogy further, in a poetic style as well. Imperious sees the dead and turn to clay, might stop a hole to keep the wind away. Oh, that the earth which kept the world in awe should patch a wall to expel the water's floor. So we have this kind of poetic kind of reducing of Hamlet's character, of the kind of nature of Julius Caesar here. Now, that ends the first part of the scene. So it's an interesting scene. I think in terms of the political arguments that are being made here, it's really interesting. I think fundamentally what it does is it kind of really rams home this idea of death as an equalizing force, and death as something that reduces you to nothing, and it will do that to anybody, either whether you're a prince, a monarch, or whether you are the lowly gravedigger, somebody lower than that, a peasant. It will happen to all of you, which I think is a really interesting point. It builds on that point from earlier in the play quite nicely. and it's pretty clear and coherent. So, from that Marxist perspective, you're looking at, hey, hang on, here's a kind of argument in the text that suggests this perhaps slightly more kind of frustrated and kind of like, revolutionary ideals, except for the fact that the rest of the play, doesn't support this. There's a fully established monarchical system. Hamlet alights Fortinbras because he seems to be a good king, and the narrative doesn't at any point suggest that having a king is necessarily bad. All it really seems to suggest, I suppose, is that this king is bad. You just need a good king. But also it has this subversive content as well. So it's a really interesting thing. And you can play around this for hours in terms of thinking about, like, well, is this message legitimately Hamlet? Is this what actually the message of Hamlet is supposed to be? But it has to be modified for its audience at the time period, bearing in mind who these plays are produced and performed for. So all of this stuff, guys, all of this AO5 ultimately is dependent on AO3 as well. You, as a critic of the time period, would have to look at this play and think about, who and what is this being used for, to access and to do. Now, to bring us back to a quick, our second poll for the day, let me type it in now. Here it is. We've got time for it, which is good. This scene for me, ultimately, then, is a scene about looking at two things. Either, and I put this actually as the debate question for the prep sheet today, is that it's kind of two things at once. You've got all the jokes from the Gravedigger, and all of his interactions with Hamlet and the other man, and we've got all of the kind of more philosophical content from both the Gravedigger, but mostly from about Hamlet. So is this scene about kind of humour? Is it a lightening scene for the play, to kind of contrast against the kind of the building tension for the end of the play, or is it actually a scene about kind of reflections on and understanding death? Yeah, that Hamlet becomes aware of his own mortality. So I would like you to just kind of put your response in there as we move on to the second half of the scene. The scene does have a kind of very kind of prominent split. As it moves into the second part, we have this full procession come in, the king, the queen, Laertes, and other lords and priests after the corpse itself. So while Hamlet is kind of finishing off his little poem, he shushes it up so that they can watch the king, the queen, the courtiers. Who is this they follow, and with such maimed rites? Now, maimed rites is a really interesting bit of language there. So he describes the rites. You'll probably have seen. You've probably seen the word rites used in any kind of religious context previously. Here, what we're talking about is the rites, the ceremonial rites of a funeral. Yeah. Now, the word maimed, to be maimed, is where somebody is essentially, wounded, disfigured, damaged. So Hamlet here essentially argues that the funeral procession, that whatever figure he is, because he does not know who it is, he hasn't been here for Ophelia's death, whoever it is, they have had their traditional funeral process greatly reduced from its normal status, what would be considered a normal funeral. So there's clearly something off with it. It's clear that while she has gotten a funeral as a suicide, which is rare, she has not got the full funeral. And Hamlet says, "This doth betoken the corpse they follow did with desperate hand fordo its own life." So Hamlet's like, this seems to me like a suicide. Yeah. Whether or not it was, we don't know. We know why it is, but Hamlet knows it was a suicide, but it was off some estate, i.e., it had some position and status because it's getting a burial. Again, that kind of issue of class coming up again. Couch we a while and mark, i.e., let's hide and have a see what's going on. Now Laertes comes in. Here's Laertes. What ceremony else? What else is she going to get? What other burial rites will she have? This is a little bit too little. Hamlet to Horatio, inexplicably here, I don't know why this happens. Hamlet decides to tell Horatio who Laertes is at this point. Horatio has been in the castle for a long time. He was here when Laertes came back. He was there when, Ophelia was going mad. It seems odd that he has to do this, other than to the point that he says, he's reinforcing Laertes' nobility just to kind of amplify the kind of dramatic impact of what comes up next. Because otherwise it just seems like an odd decision. So a very noble youth, Mark. Laertes repeats his question without a response from the priest. We don't actually see the priest's response yet. Laertes asks again, what ceremony else? What else is my sister going to get? And the priest really shuts him down here. He says, her obsequies have been as far as enlarged as we have warranty. Basically, we've given her the best we could. Her death was doubtful, but that great command, i.e. the king's command, oversways the order she should in ground unsanctified be lodged till the last trumpet. So here he's basically saying the king basically, or somebody, but probably the king, has forced through this this funeral. Otherwise, as he says here, she should be in ground unsanctified until judgment day. For charitable prayers, flints and pebbles should be thrown on her. Yet she is allowed her virgin krantz, her maiden struments, and the bringing home of bell and barrels. He's like, look, we've given her some stuff. She should have much less than this. You cannot ask for more. Yeah, it would be outrageous for you to do that. Interesting here that she's been given her virginal and maiden kind of decorations and flowers and whatever. Interesting, bearing in mind obviously the potential stuff we talked about in Act 4, Scene 5, with the potentiality of her having had a relationship with Hamlet that was physical. So Laertes is like, look, must there be no more done? Like, can we just have nothing more? And the priest said, nope, no more to be done. And this is actually, as you can notice, it's hard to tell because it's across 2 pages, but this is a split line here, which actually suggests the priest's kind of perhaps immediacy. And it happens again. The two of them are almost having into quite an intense argument here. No more to be done. We should profane the service of the dead to sing a requiem and such rest to her as to peace-parted souls. Basically, it would make unholy and corrupt the service of the kind of regular dead if we give her the same rites and same songs and whatever as people who died honestly, so to speak. So Laertes continues, lay her in the earth, and from her fair and unpolluted flesh may violet spring. I tell thee, churlish priest. So he starts kind of mugging off the priest here, essentially. A ministering angel shall my sister be when thou liest howling. So he's particularly cruel to the priest here. Starts kind of damning him almost. Hamlet now realises that it's Ophelia, which he kind of comes to that conclusion here. The Queen has a really interesting set of lines here. Sweets to the sweet, again, that kind of language being used about Ophelia again. Farewell, I hoped thou shouldst. So again, she adopts the thou format, so we're in that kind of more personal, intimate structure and style. Thou shouldst have been my Hamlet's wife. I thought thy bride bed to have decked, sweet maid, and not have strewed thy grave. So this is a really interesting line. So Polonius, obviously, earlier in the play, has a real doubt about Hamlet's legitimacy and intentions with regards to Ophelia. He really doesn't think that Hamlet is in any way interested in her. But here, or at least he worries that Hamlet is going to mess around with her. Here, the Queen, Gertrude's opinion seemed to be that Hamlet was intent on marrying her. So if the Queen has this intent in mind, it does seem likely that perhaps Hamlet's feelings for her were very genuine indeed. And Laertes, kind of having heard Hamlet's name mentioned, is, oh, treble woe fall 10 times double on that cursed head. So he essentially curses Hamlet here. Not unfairly, given that he's murdered his father and now essentially driven, as he says here, thou wicked, whose wicked deed thy most ingenious sense deprived thee of. Hold off the earth a while till I caught her once more in mine arms. So actually says, like, look, that guy, Hamlet, screw him. He killed my dad. He's driven my sister insane and she's now killed herself. And he's like, I don't want to hear his name. He's cursed. And he's like, look, hold off the earth. Don't bury her yet. I want to hold her in my arms again. And it all gets a bit weird. He jumps in the grave with her, sometimes often holding up her body, which is always a bit, it's shades of, not quite the same kind of sexual overtones, but shades of Wuthering Heights here. And he asks, now pile your dust upon the quick and the dead. That phrase being used for, I think, the 3rd time in this scene. Till off this flat a mountain you have made to overtop old Pelion, or that skyish head of blue Olympus. So he's like, look, I'm in here now. Bury us both together with a giant mound of earth, the highest mound of earth, till it overtops old Pelion, or the sky a shade of blue Olympus. Now, Pelion you probably won't know, but Olympus you probably will know, obviously, as being the physical location of the peak of it being the physical location of the Greek gods. Obviously, anybody who can tell us who the king of those gods is and who resides up there would be excellent. And Pelion is a nearby mountain that was supposedly used by the Greek gods' great enemies, the Titans, to try and take the mountain from them. So at this kind of outrageously excessive and elaborate kind of grief, Hamlet steps forward from behind his shadow, where he's been hiding a bush, a hedge, behind a gravestone, whatever. And he is like, what is he whose grief bears such an emphasis, whose phrase absolutely as it is Zeus is the king of things, is the king of Olympus, absolutely bang on. Whose phrase of sorrow conjures the wandering stars and makes them stand like wonder-wounded heroes. This is I, Hamlet the Dane. Now it's likely, as it says in your footnotes at this point, that he will reveal like his costume. He'll fling off his cape and reveal himself as Hamlet the Dane. A lovely kind of bit, nice bit of identity stuff here. Hamlet really reinforcing it. I am Hamlet. I am the Danish Hamlet. I am the king of Hamlet. King of Hamlet. He's the king. He's the king of Denmark, not the king of Hamlet. That's not a place. So Laertes immediately, very athletic Laertes, having jumped in a grave, now immediately jumps back out of the grave and grapples with Hamlet. They have a little fight. And the devil will take thy soul. It's like really aggressive. He's straight on him, and Hamlet is kind of mocking him. Thou prayest not well. I.e., you stop choking me. Your prayer isn't going well. Take thy fingers from my throat. For though I am not spleenative rash, I am not as aggressive as you. I am not as bloodily violent as you, and kind of quick to anger. Yet I do have something in me dangerous, which let thy wisdom fierce. He's like, look, I'm not as rowdy as you are, but if you keep pushing me, I'm gonna smack you one. He said, hold off thy hand. The king basically asks for them to be pulled apart. The queen, it's all a mess. It's just a mess. This is visually, I only ever imagine this scene as essentially a chip shop fight at 2 a.m. The king's there like, stop it. The queen's going like, it's not worth it, Hamlet. Essentially, Hamlet. The lords in the background say, gentlemen, and even Horatio has to come in to kind of pull them apart. And Hamlet's like, nope, I'm going to keep on fighting with this theme until I die, until my eyelids no longer wag. It's like, I will keep on this theme forever. And she's like, oh, my son, what theme? And Hamlet kind of reinforces his love for Ophelia. Quite tricky now, given how cruel he's been to her across the course of the play. Because I loved Ophelia. 40,000 brothers could not with their quantity of love make up my son. What wilt thou do for her? So he asks, Laertes, what would you do? You couldn't do as much as I do. I love her. 40,000 brothers could not love her as much as I do. And the king is like, just ignore him. He's just mad. It's fine. Just leave him be. And the queen is like, for the love of God, just put up with him. And Hamlet is like, swoons. Show me what thou do. Would you weep? Would you fight? Would you fast? Would you tear thyself? All reasonable. And then he's like, would you drink up Isle, which is like a really strong vinegar? Would you eat a crocodile? I'll do it. So he's basically mocking, at this point, Laertes' really exaggerative claims of grief when he asks for the big mountain to be poured on himself. Hamlet is going like, you're just talking nonsense, essentially, yeah? This is nothing. You can say what you want, fundamentally. And this is very reminiscent, again, obviously if you can kind of remember it, this is very reminiscent of Hamlet's kind of earlier speech in the play, the whole seems not is section in Act 1, Scene 2. He says, what are you coming here to whine, to outface me with basically to kind of show me up with jumping in her grave to be buried quick with her? Then so I'll do that as well. If thou prate of mountains, let them throw millions of acres on us until our ground, singeing his paint against the burning zone, makes Ossa like a wall. Again, Ossa, another mountain, makes it look tiny like a little wart. So he's like, look, you'll mouth off and I'll rant as well as you can. Basically Hamlet's pointing out to Laertes that just saying a bunch of stuff doesn't mean anything. Yeah, we could all say we do a bunch of things, but if we don't do them, it doesn't really matter, and it doesn't really suggest the kind of actual meaning behind it. So that's a really good point there. The queen then is essentially kind of a bit, traumatized by this. This is mere madness, and thus a while the fit will work on him. Anon, as patient as the female dove when her that golden couplets are disclosed, his silence will sit drooping. So he's like, look, he'll just let him be. He is mad. Even though it does seem very consistent with Hamlet's previous arguments, which makes it, to me, suggest that it's not actually realistically madness, but that this is just Hamlet's thoughts and opinions. Because it's so consistent with his arguments earlier in the play, he's so against this kind of like performative aspect of grief and grieving. As well as that, what I mentioned here is when he does say here, I'll be buried too, you might actually find that in most productions, the actor playing Hamlet will also jump in the grave at that point to kind of prove the point further. Hamlet has a final address here, and that's the kind of really kind of like rounding off of the scene. Oops. What is the reason you use me thus? I loved you ever. Why do you abuse me so much? Why are you being so horrible to me? Which, again, not a really reasonable question as far as you can tell, but there you go. But it's no matter. Let Hercules himself do what he may. The cat will mew and the dog will have his day. So he's like, look, I will get what I want. I'll be, nothing can, you're not going to stop me. I've got extra stuff to do here. And he suggests that he couldn't even be stopped by Hercules. Now, as a character who earlier in the play, essentially compared himself unfavourably to Hercules, who kind of emasculated himself against Hercules. It is interesting now that at this point in the play, Hamlet seems to feel that he is not the same. He is no longer the same kind of weakened figure against Hercules, and that he could, regardless of what other Hercules wants to do, that Hamlet can just brush past it and do what he wants, which suggests a real change in Hamlet's kind of feelings about himself, his own activity, his own kind of, direction and autonomy. Okay, so hopefully that's quite a useful point there. The king, I pray thee, good Horatio, wait upon him. So at this point, we have Hamlet, Hamlet's leaving. The king asks good Horatio to go with him, and then has a little aside to Laertes. That kind of cunning, scheming comes back. He's like, strengthen your patience. Think about our last night speech. So that kind of positions Act 4, Scene 7 to the last night. We'll put the matter to the present push. Good Gertrude, and we go back to the kind of main. Set some watch over your son. This grave shall have a living monument. An hour of quiet thereby shall we see. Till then, in peace, patience our proceeding be. So we assume here that it's going to be given some kind of guard, I would imagine. I assume that it means that there's just going to be some kind of protective force, that there will be around the thing to allow the grave to have some kind of undisturbed time. Okay? So that's Act 5, Scene 1. Both of the scenes in Act 5 are quite long. It's interesting, as we talked about earlier, that rather than come straight back into play and get everything, back, fully on things, we have this little scene here between Hamlet and Laertes. Before we finish, I would like you just to drop in the comments, please, and I want we've got, how many have we got here? 19 people watching at the moment. I want a bunch of comments in here to think why you think this is happening at the start of Act 5. Act 5 should be our big, this should be our big kind of climactic act. It's the end of the play. Why do we have this time here for, as most of us voted, I can reveal the poll results, although you can probably see them yourselves. The poll results was very heavily that this scene, you think, was mostly about reflecting on death. One of us kind of thinking that the main focus was comedy. Just jot in the comments, please, guys, and I'll wait for a couple of seconds. I want to see these, please. What do you think this scene does? Why is it here? What is its narrative role, bearing in mind that we're only one scene from the end of the play? Excellent. In the meantime, I'll put some critical reading up so that you can have a look at that. Okay, brilliant. There was loads of good comments there, and keep them coming in as well, please. Um, I think most of us are kind of really reinforcing about the nature of death here, and the effects of it. Obviously, with the imminent death of I think how many characters in the final scene? Who dies in the final scene? Probably 4 or 5 characters. Then I think it gives us a nice reflection on it. I think absolutely, this idea of the importance of death, the significance effect, the kind of dramatic foreshadowing of the death in the next scene. I think that's absolutely right, and it gives us and Hamlet that moment of reflection as well. I would also suggest at this point, guys, to think about as well Hamlet's attitude towards death earlier in the play. Think about earlier in the play when he is kind of afraid of the unknown country from whose bourne no traveller returns, and now he's kind of come to terms with it, as you say, and as you've rightly pointed out here, he seems to almost have come to terms with his own death a little bit as well, and we'll get to that next time. Okay, so good, lovely, excellent. Now, good stuff. What we'll do then next time is, as I said, next week is going to be our last scene of the play. It might be a little bit longer next week, so prepare for that. It's quite a long scene. I'm going to have to skip through certain bits. I'm going to have to give you a couple of things. I'm going to give you 2 prep sheets for it because there's a lot of stuff to go through. Absolutely, some more good comments coming in here. Good stuff. Yeah. Absolutely. Perfect. Perfect. Good. Keep hold of a couple of those ideas as well. Copy some of them down. So, perfect. That's it. 5-1 done. 5-2 to go. After that, as I said before, next week we're going to be doing a Duchess of Malfi essay, and I'll prep you a little bit at the start of it as well. I'll mention that in the session as well. And then, realistically, from this point onwards, we're going to be doing, for the rest of this term, it's going to be revision ahead of the exam. So I'm going to do a couple of stream sessions on some kind of revising content. And then, we're going to be getting ourselves prepped for the summer. And I'm going to be going through some coursework stuff to help you with that. So that's a separate thing that we'll get to later on in the term. But for next week, please make sure that, obviously you're finishing all the stuff that you got to do this week. As a quick reminder what your tasks were, here they are. So we've got so to read and annotate Act 5 Scene 1, the prep sheet's there, A4 page of notes on the Grave Diggers conversation. Hopefully what we've done today will help you out a little bit with that, and then to create a poster or presentation on Laertes. So as a nice character, now that he's nearly at his end, please use content from 5.2 as well, because you're going to kind of need to read 5.2 in advance. And next week, please, it's quite a long one, so I don't want to spend the whole time just talking through it. And then once that's all done, guys, that's pretty much it. Good stuff. I will see you next week. Well, I won't see you. You'll see me next week. What I might also do as well is before we do the essay next week, is I might have a couple of... we might do some Zoom chats with the individual classes and see what we can do there to try and get something in so that we can all have a good discussion. Okay? All right. Enjoy. I'll see you later.